The Nutmeg of Consolation by Patrick O'Brien. Read by Robert Hardy. 157 castaways on a desert island in the South China Sea. The survivors of the wreck of HMS Diane. 157, but there, round a bare piece of ground between high water mark and the forest, they sounded like the full complement of a ship of the line. For this was Sunday afternoon, and the starboard watch, headed by Captain Aubrey, was engaged in a cricket match against the Marines under their commanding officer, Mr. Welby. It was a match that aroused the strongest passions, and required uncommon fortitude, since the atmosphere was as wet as a living sponge, and the heat oppressive. The only impartial observer was Stephen Maturin, the ship's surgeon, who thought cricket the most tedious occupation known to man, and who was climbing away from it through the forest, with the intention first of killing a boar, and then of reaching the north side where the bird's nest soup swallows nested. On the knoll where the boar track led inland, he paused and looked down on the southern shore. Well out to sea on his left, the uncharted reef on which the frigate had struck. Left again, the scoured-out inlet where a large piece of the wreck that had come ashore had been carefully prized apart and reassembled in the present ribbed skeleton of the schooner that was to carry them to Batavia as soon as it was planked, decked, and rigged. Well up the slope from this inlet was the camp in which they had sheltered from the typhoon that destroyed the stranded frigate, drowned many of her people, her livestock, and almost all her powder. It might seem the height of levity to be playing cricket with the schooner far from finished, with stores very low, and the island's resources in coconuts and boars very nearly exhausted. Yet Stephen knew very well what was in Jack Aubrey's mind. The people had behaved extremely well so far, working double tides, but some relaxation was essential, and they'd been looking forward to this match with the liveliest anticipation. Stephen, slinging his rifle, turned away. It was an exceptionally fine rifle, inherited from Mr. Fox, the British envoy they had brought out to counteract the French negotiations with the Sultan of Pulo Prabang. Fox had obtained a treaty, and eager to carry it to London, he and most of his suite had set out in the frigate's pinnace, with an officer and crew, to sail the remaining 200 miles to Batavia, and been overtaken by the same typhoon that shattered the grounded Diane. Stephen was a deadly shot, and since there was so little powder, he was the camp's chief hunter. The trail he was following was more promising than any he'd seen for some while. It was so recent that when it reached a spiny rattan patch, he saw the outer rim of the deep hoof-print fall in. "I shall go round and wait for him," said Stephen. He climbed a tree that commanded the path and sat at his ease, embowered in orchids, and when the boar emerged, he dropped it dead. He had an apron in his knapsack and put it on to Gralach, his pig. He also had a light tackle that allowed him to heave the beast up to a branch. He hung his apron there, and with real satisfaction set off to the swallow's most spectacular cliff. The wholly sheltered nests were pearly white and translucent. These were the nests deepest in the caves, or rather clefts in the seaward precipice, and Stephen could see the best only from one place, where his particular cave soared up from a broad stretch of shingle 200 feet below to a narrow fissure at the top. He had an indifferent head for heights, but here he could lie flat, with his arms and legs spread out, his body firmly pressed against the warm, level rock, and only his face hanging over the void, gazing at the cloud of little grey birds that flew in at the widest part of the cave, whirled about at an extraordinary speed, and then shot off from the general vortex, each to its own nest. He leant further into the cavity, and almost at once his wig fell off, vanishing among the bird-filled shadows far below. His wild attempt at catching the wig had brought him into a much better position. Certainly it meant that the sun shone right onto the back of his unprotected head, but it allowed him to lie in the utmost comfort, his face far deeper into the cleft. Now he could make out the nests themselves.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?